The story of John Wesley Hardin begins not with gunfire, but with the echoes of a nation torn apart by civil war. To understand the man who would become one of the most discussed figures of the American Old West, we must first journey back to the Texas of his youth, a place where the boundaries between law and survival were often blurred, and where the choices made by young men were shaped as much by circumstance as by character. John Wesley Hardin was born on May 26, 1853, in Bonham, Texas, to James Gibson Hardin and Mary Elizabeth Dixon Hardin. His father was a Methodist preacher and circuit rider, a man of faith who traveled across the rough Texas countryside bringing religious services to scattered communities. The choice of his son's name was deliberate and meaningful. John Wesley Hardin was named after John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, reflecting the deep religious convictions that guided the Hardin household. It is one of history's profound ironies that a boy named after a man of peace would grow to be associated with violence and conflict. The Texas into which young Hardin was born was a place of dramatic change and uncertainty. The state had joined the Confederacy in 1861, and the Civil War that followed would leave deep scars across the social and political landscape. While Hardin was too young to fight in the war himself, he grew up surrounded by its consequences. Texas communities were divided, families were torn apart by differing loyalties, and the aftermath of the conflict created an environment where traditional authority structures had broken down. Understanding this context is essential to understanding the man Hardin would become. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Texas entered the difficult period known as Reconstruction. Federal troops occupied the state, and new governments were established under Northern supervision. For many Texans, particularly those who had supported the Confederacy, this was a time of resentment and resistance. The social order that had existed before the war was overturned, and in many areas, competing claims to authority created confusion and sometimes chaos. Into this uncertain world, young John Wesley Hardin came of age. The Hardin family was not wealthy, but they were respectable members of their community. James Hardin's position as a preacher gave the family a certain standing, and he was known as an educated man in a time and place where formal education was not common. He attempted to pass on his learning to his children, and John Wesley received more schooling than many boys of his time and place. He learned to read and write proficiently, skills that would serve him throughout his life. Later accounts suggest that even in his youth, Hardin was intelligent and quick-minded, though also known for a fierce temper. Hardin's early years were spent in a rural environment where practical skills were essential for survival. Like most boys of his era and region, he learned to ride horses, handle livestock, and use firearms from a young age. In the Texas countryside of the 1860s, these were not unusual skills but necessary ones. Wild animals, the need to hunt for food, and the general uncertainties of frontier life meant that familiarity with weapons was common and expected. For Hardin, this early exposure to firearms would prove significant in ways his family could not have anticipated. The first serious trouble in Hardin's life came when he was just 15 years old, in 1868. According to historical records and Hardin's own later accounts, he became involved in an altercation with a former enslaved person named Mage. The details of this encounter have been debated by historians, and various versions of the story exist. What is documented is that the confrontation turned physical and resulted in Mage's death. Hardin claimed he acted in self-defense, stating that Mage had attacked him. Whether this account is fully accurate remains a matter of historical debate, but what followed is clear. Rather than face what he feared would be unfair treatment under the Reconstruction government, Hardin fled. This decision to run rather than face legal proceedings set Hardin on a path that would define the rest of his life. In the context of Reconstruction Texas, Hardin's fear of the legal system was not entirely without foundation. Many white Texans believed that the courts under Reconstruction authority would not treat them fairly, particularly in cases involving racial conflict. Whether or not this belief was justified in Hardin's specific case, it shaped his choice, and that choice had lasting consequences. As a fugitive, the teenage Hardin found himself living outside the boundaries of settled society. He moved from place to place, staying with relatives and sympathetic acquaintances, always aware that authorities might be searching for him. This period of his life introduced him to others who lived on the margins of the law, and he began to develop the skills and reputation that would later define him. He became known as someone who was quick with a weapon and unafraid of confrontation. In the unsettled conditions of post-war Texas, such a reputation could be both protective and dangerous. During this time, Hardin became involved in the violent conflicts that plagued parts of Texas during Reconstruction. Various groups competed for power and influence, and personal disputes often escalated into armed confrontations. Hardin aligned himself with certain factions and individuals, and found himself repeatedly in situations where violence occurred. Each incident seemed to push him further from any possibility of returning to a conventional life. The pattern that would characterize his next several years was being established: confrontation, followed by flight, a growing reputation, and an increasing distance from the law-abiding society his father had hoped he would join. It is important to note that the Texas of this period was experiencing significant lawlessness in many areas. The traditional law enforcement structures had been disrupted by the war, and the new authorities established during Reconstruction often lacked the resources or local support to maintain order effectively. In many communities, informal justice and personal retaliation were common. Feuds between families or groups could persist for years, and the line between criminal and community defender was often unclear. Hardin existed within this complex social landscape, where actions that might seem clearly criminal in one context could be viewed differently by those who shared his perspective on Reconstruction authority. By his late teens, Hardin had become associated with cattle driving, one of the major industries of post-war Texas. The great cattle drives that moved herds from Texas to railheads in Kansas were reaching their peak during this period, and they offered employment to young men who could ride well and handle difficult conditions. Hardin worked on several of these drives, and the experience took him far from his East Texas origins. The trail drives were demanding and sometimes dangerous work, bringing together men from various backgrounds in close quarters for weeks or months at a time. Disputes were common, and the remote conditions meant that formal law enforcement was often absent. During one of these cattle drives in 1871, when Hardin was 18 years old, he was involved in a significant incident in Abilene, Kansas. Abilene was then one of the major cattle towns, a place where Texas drovers met northern buyers, and where tensions between the rough cattlemen and town authorities frequently arose. The marshal of Abilene at that time was Wild Bill Hickok, himself a legendary figure of the Old West. According to various accounts, Hardin and Hickok had encounters during Hardin's time in Abilene, though the exact nature and number of these encounters is debated by historians. What is documented is that Hardin left Abilene abruptly and returned to Texas, adding to his growing list of places where he was wanted by authorities. Back in Texas, Hardin continued the pattern of movement and conflict that had characterized his recent years. He married Jane Bowen in 1872, suggesting that despite his fugitive status, he maintained connections to conventional society and harbored hopes for a more settled life. Jane came from a respectable family, and their marriage produced 3 children over the following years. This domestic aspect of Hardin's life stands in stark contrast to his public reputation, and it reveals the complexity of his character. He was simultaneously a family man attempting to build a normal life and a wanted fugitive known for his involvement in violence. The early 1870s saw Hardin involved in one of the major feuds that plagued Texas during this period. The Sutton-Taylor feud was a complex conflict in DeWitt County, Texas, involving competing families and their allies, with roots in disputes over land, cattle, and political power. The feud was characterized by ambushes, reprisals, and cycles of violence that drew in an ever-widening circle of participants. Hardin allied himself with the Taylor faction, and his involvement in the feud added significantly to his reputation as a dangerous man. The feud also brought him into conflict with law enforcement officials who sided with the Sutton faction, further complicating his legal situation. During these years, Hardin's reputation grew not just through his actions, but through the stories told about him. In an era before mass media, information spread through word of mouth, newspaper reports, and letters. Stories of Hardin's confrontations and narrow escapes circulated widely, and like many figures of the Old West, he became the subject of legend and exaggeration. Some accounts credited him with an improbably high number of violent encounters, while others portrayed him as either a dangerous criminal or a man defending himself against unjust persecution, depending on the perspective of the teller. This process of legend building would continue throughout Hardin's life and beyond. It is worth considering the broader historical context in which Hardin's story unfolded. The period from the end of the Civil War through the mid-1870s was a transitional time for Texas and the American West more broadly. The frontier was closing, railroads were expanding, and federal authority was gradually extending into previously remote areas. At the same time, traditional patterns of settlement and social organization were being disrupted. The cattle industry was booming, bringing new wealth but also new conflicts. Towns were growing rapidly, creating demands for more formal systems of law and order. Into this dynamic and often chaotic environment came figures like Hardin, whose personal choices both reflected and contributed to the turbulence of the times. By the mid-1870s, Hardin was one of the most wanted men in Texas. Multiple jurisdictions sought his arrest for various offenses, and rewards were offered for his capture. He continued to move frequently, using false names and relying on a network of friends and relatives for shelter and assistance. Despite his fugitive status, he maintained contact with his wife and children, demonstrating a desire to preserve some elements of a normal family life, even as circumstances made that increasingly difficult. This tension between his roles as wanted criminal and family man would persist throughout his active years. The situation could not continue indefinitely. As Texas society became more organized and law enforcement became more effective, the spaces where someone like Hardin could operate with relative freedom were shrinking. The stage was being set for the events that would eventually bring his years as a fugitive to an end. But before that conclusion, there would be more conflict, more movement, and more additions to the legend that surrounded him. The boy named for a founder of Methodism had become a man whose name was spoken with fear, respect, or condemnation, depending on who was speaking. How this transformation happened, and what it tells us about both the individual and his times, remains a subject of fascination for historians and enthusiasts of Old West history. Understanding John Wesley Hardin requires understanding the world that shaped him. He was a product of his time and place, a time when Texas was recovering from war, adjusting to new political realities, and experiencing the tensions between frontier independence and encroaching civilization. His early experiences, his family background, and the choices available to him all contributed to the path his life took. As we continue to examine his story, we will see how the patterns established in these formative years played out in the decades to come, and how the man and the myth became intertwined in the history of the American Old West. The period from 1873 to 1877 represents the most active and turbulent years of John Wesley Hardin's life, a time when his reputation solidified and his name became synonymous with the dangerous unpredictability of the Texas frontier. These years saw Hardin moving constantly across the state, involved in numerous conflicts, and becoming increasingly entangled in the violent disputes that characterized the era. To understand this phase of his life is to understand the volatile nature of Texas society during the 1870s, when the state was caught between its frontier past and an uncertain future. By 1873, Hardin had already established himself as a figure to be reckoned with in the complex social landscape of Reconstruction Texas. He was 20 years old, married with a young family, and wanted by authorities in multiple counties. The contrast between his domestic responsibilities and his fugitive lifestyle created a tension that would define these years. He attempted to maintain connections with his wife Jane and their children, moving them periodically to different locations for their safety, while simultaneously engaging in activities that made a stable family life increasingly impossible. The ongoing Sutton-Taylor feud continued to occupy much of Hardin's attention during this period. This conflict, centered in DeWitt County but spreading to surrounding areas, had evolved into one of the most bitter and prolonged feuds in Texas history. The original causes of the dispute had become almost secondary to the cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation that characterized the violence. Hardin's involvement with the Taylor faction meant he was not merely a lone gunman, but part of a larger network of allies and enemies, all caught up in a conflict that seemed to have no clear resolution. The nature of feuding in Texas during this era requires some explanation to fully appreciate Hardin's situation. These were not simple criminal enterprises, but complex social conflicts that involved questions of honor, loyalty, family obligation, and competing claims to authority. Participants often saw themselves not as outlaws, but as defenders of their families and communities against unjust persecution. The reality was usually more complicated, with both sides engaging in actions that could be considered criminal, while also claiming legitimate grievances. Hardin operated within this morally ambiguous environment, where distinguishing between aggressor and defender was rarely straightforward. During 1873 and 1874, Hardin's movements across Texas were frequent and unpredictable. He would appear in one county, become involved in some incident, and then disappear before authorities could organize an effective response. This pattern was facilitated by the limitations of law enforcement in the period. Communication between different jurisdictions was slow, coordination was difficult, and the vast distances of Texas meant that a man who knew the country well and had friends willing to shelter him could evade capture for considerable periods. Hardin took full advantage of these circumstances, developing a network of safe houses and supporters across multiple counties. One of the notable aspects of Hardin's reputation during these years was his claimed proficiency with firearms. In an era when skill with weapons was common among men on the frontier, Hardin was said to stand out for his speed and accuracy. Various accounts from the period describe him as exceptionally quick in drawing and firing his revolvers, and this reputation contributed significantly to the fear he inspired. It is important to note that many such accounts come from later recollections and may be influenced by the legend that grew around him, but contemporary evidence suggests that his skills were indeed considerable. In the social environment of the 1870s Texas frontier, such a reputation could serve as a form of protection, as others might think twice before confronting someone known to be particularly dangerous. The relationship between Hardin and law enforcement during this period was complex and adversarial. Some officers saw him simply as a criminal who needed to be brought to justice. Others, particularly those sympathetic to the Confederate cause or hostile to Reconstruction Authority, viewed him with more ambivalence. There were even instances where local communities seemed to offer him a degree of protection, reflecting the divided loyalties that characterized Texas society during these years. The state police, established during Reconstruction and often staffed by individuals loyal to the federal government, were particularly active in pursuing Hardin, which only reinforced his status among some Texans as a victim of oppressive Northern authority. In May 1874, an event occurred that would prove significant in eventually bringing Hardin's fugitive years to an end, though he did not know it at the time. Charles Webb, a deputy sheriff from Brown County, was killed in Comanche, Texas, in circumstances that involved Hardin. The details of this incident have been disputed, with different accounts presenting conflicting versions of what happened and who bore primary responsibility. What is clear is that Webb's death provoked a strong response from law enforcement authorities. Webb had been a respected officer, and his killing galvanized efforts to capture those responsible. For Hardin, this meant increased danger and increased determination on the part of authorities to bring him into custody. Following the Webb incident, Hardin recognized that his situation in Texas had become untenable. The level of attention from law enforcement had intensified to a degree that made his usual pattern of movement and evasion more difficult. He made the decision to leave Texas entirely, taking his family and attempting to establish a new life in a place where his reputation and legal troubles might not follow. This decision led him to Florida, a state far removed from the conflicts and feuds of Texas, where he hoped to start fresh under an assumed name. The Florida period of Hardin's life, from late 1874 through 1877, represents an interesting interlude in his story. Using the alias J.H. Swain, Hardin attempted to live quietly and engage in legitimate business activities. He invested in timber operations and tried to establish himself as a respectable member of the community. For a time, this strategy seemed to work. He was far from Texas, using a different name, and conducting himself in a manner that did not draw particular attention. His family was with him, and there seemed to be a possibility that he might actually succeed in leaving his violent past behind and building a new life. However, the past proved difficult to escape. Despite his efforts at concealment, word of his location eventually reached Texas authorities. The determination to capture Hardin had not diminished during his absence from the state. The rewards offered for his arrest made him a tempting target for those who made their living tracking wanted men. Additionally, the expansion of railroad and telegraph networks across the country was making it increasingly difficult for fugitives to simply disappear into new locations. The infrastructure of modern law enforcement was developing, and the spaces where someone like Hardin could hide were shrinking. The man who would ultimately bring Hardin's fugitive years to an end was John Armstrong, a Texas Ranger who had been assigned the task of tracking him down. Armstrong was a determined and skilled lawman, and he pursued leads methodically until he established Hardin's location in Florida. The decision to send a Texas Ranger to another state to apprehend a fugitive reflected the seriousness with which Texas authorities viewed the Hardin case. Armstrong's pursuit also demonstrates the increasing professionalization of law enforcement during this period, as agencies developed the capability to coordinate across jurisdictions and pursue fugitives over long distances. On August 23, 1877, Armstrong and a small group of men located Hardin on a train in Pensacola, Florida. The arrest did not go smoothly, and there was a brief struggle during which shots were fired. Hardin was ultimately subdued and taken into custody, bringing his years as a fugitive to an end. The arrest was a significant event, widely reported in newspapers across Texas and beyond. The capture of John Wesley Hardin was seen as a victory for law and order, evidence that even the most notorious figures could not evade justice indefinitely. The circumstances of Hardin's arrest marked a turning point not just in his personal story, but in the broader narrative of the American West. The methods used to track and capture him, including interstate cooperation between law enforcement agencies and the use of modern communication technology, represented a new era in criminal justice. The days when a wanted man could simply ride to a new territory and start over were ending. The expansion of governmental authority and the development of more sophisticated law enforcement capabilities were changing the nature of the frontier, making it increasingly difficult for individuals to operate outside the bounds of established legal systems. After his arrest, Hardin was returned to Texas to face trial for the death of Charles Webb. The trial took place in Comanche, Texas, and attracted considerable public attention. Hardin's attorneys attempted to argue self-defense, claiming that Webb had drawn his weapon first, and that Hardin had acted to protect his own life. The prosecution presented a different narrative, arguing that Hardin was a dangerous criminal whose pattern of violence needed to be stopped. The jury ultimately found Hardin guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in the state penitentiary. The trial and conviction of John Wesley Hardin represented more than just the resolution of a single case. It symbolized the changing nature of Texas society and the gradual establishment of more formal systems of justice. The era when personal disputes were settled through private violence was giving way to a period when state authority and legal institutions were becoming more firmly established. Hardin's conviction demonstrated that even individuals with significant reputations and networks of support could be held accountable through the legal system. Reflecting on Hardin's active years from 1873 to 1877, several themes emerge that help us understand both the man and his times. First, his story illustrates the continuation of frontier violence well into the 1870s, a period when many parts of the United States were becoming more settled and orderly, but when Texas still experienced significant lawlessness. Second, his ability to evade capture for so long reflects both his personal capabilities and the limitations of law enforcement during the period. Third, his eventual capture and conviction demonstrate the gradual extension of state authority and the development of more effective law enforcement capabilities. The question of how many actual violent encounters Hardin was involved in during these years remains disputed among historians. Hardin himself later claimed a very high number, but many historians believe his accounts were exaggerated, either due to faulty memory, a desire to enhance his reputation, or both. What is documented through court records, newspaper accounts, and other contemporary sources suggests a significant number of incidents, though perhaps not as many as later legend would suggest. The exact count is less important than understanding the pattern of conflict and violence that characterized these years of his life. It is also worth considering the human cost of the violence associated with Hardin and the broader conflicts in which he participated. Each incident involved real people, families left bereaved, communities disrupted, and a general atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The romantic legends that grew up around figures like Hardin often obscure these human consequences, focusing instead on dramatic confrontations and narrow escapes. A more complete understanding requires acknowledging both the historical fascination these figures generate and the genuine harm caused by the violence they engaged in. The environmental and economic context of 1870s Texas also played a role in shaping Hardin's story. This was the height of the cattle drive era, when huge herds were moved from Texas to northern markets, creating both economic opportunity and social disruption. It was also a period of significant tension over land use, with conflicts between cattlemen and farmers, disputes over property boundaries, and competition for limited resources. These broader economic pressures contributed to an atmosphere where disputes could quickly escalate into violence, and where individuals like Hardin found opportunities to operate. As Hardin entered prison in 1878 to begin serving his sentence, one chapter of his life closed and another began. The man who had spent his late teens and early 20s in constant motion, always alert to danger, always ready for confrontation, now faced the prospect of years confined within prison walls. How he would respond to this dramatic change in circumstances, and what the experience of imprisonment would mean for his future, would become the next phase of his complex and troubling story. The notorious years were over, but John Wesley Hardin's story was far from finished. The story of John Wesley Hardin has always existed in a strange territory between documented history and frontier legend, where facts become embellished through countless retellings, and where the line between what actually happened and what people believed happened becomes increasingly difficult to discern. Perhaps no element of the Hardin legend better illustrates this phenomenon than the famous tale of the snoring man in the hotel room, an incident that has become one of the most repeated and discussed stories associated with his name. To understand this story, and others like it, requires us to examine not just what may have occurred, but how and why such tales became attached to historical figures of the Old West. The incident in question allegedly took place in a hotel in Abilene, Kansas, during one of Hardin's visits to that cattle town in the early 1870s. According to the most common version of the story, Hardin was attempting to sleep in his hotel room when he was disturbed by loud snoring coming from the adjacent room. After the noise continued and prevented him from resting, Hardin supposedly fired his revolver through the wall, silencing the snoring permanently. The story has been repeated in countless books, articles, and documentaries about the Old West, often presented as an example of Hardin's hair-trigger temper and casual approach to violence. However, when we examine the historical evidence for this incident, the picture becomes considerably less clear. The primary source for many stories about Hardin's life is his own autobiography, which he wrote while in prison and which was published in 1896. In this document, Hardin does describe staying in hotels in Abilene and having various encounters there, but his account of the snoring incident differs in significant details from the version that became most popular. According to Hardin's own telling, he did fire through a wall in response to noise, but his account suggests the situation was more complex than simply being annoyed by snoring, and he claimed the person in the other room survived the encounter. The differences between Hardin's account and the popular legend raise important questions about how stories evolve in the telling. When we investigate contemporary newspaper accounts from Abilene during the period when Hardin was present in the town, we find very limited documentation of such an incident. Some researchers have found references to disturbances at hotels and to Hardin's presence in town, but clear confirmation of the snoring story as it is commonly told remains elusive. This does not necessarily mean the incident never happened, but it does suggest that if something similar occurred, it may have been transformed significantly in the years that followed. Understanding why such stories became attached to figures like Hardin requires us to consider the nature of frontier society and the way information circulated in the 19th century. In an era before modern mass media, stories spread through oral tradition, through letters, and through newspaper accounts that often prioritize dramatic narrative over careful documentation. A minor incident could be exaggerated in the retelling, details could be added or changed, and different versions of the same basic story could circulate simultaneously. By the time these stories were written down in more permanent forms, They had often gone through numerous iterations, each potentially adding new elements. The figure of the gunfighter in American culture has always been surrounded by mythology, and John Wesley Hardin became one of the primary examples of this mythologizing process. During his active years in the 1870s, stories about his exploits circulated widely in Texas and beyond, often growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some of these stories portrayed him as a dangerous criminal who killed without remorse. Others, particularly among those sympathetic to the Confederate cause or hostile to Reconstruction Authority, painted him as a folk hero, standing up against oppression. Neither characterization was entirely accurate, but both contributed to the legend that developed around his name. Hardin himself was not an unwilling participant in the creation of his legend. His autobiography, written during his years in prison, presents his life story in ways that sometimes served his own interests and self-image. He portrayed many of his violent encounters as acts of self-defense or as responses to provocation, minimizing his own agency and emphasizing the circumstances that forced his hand. Modern historians approaching this document must read it critically, recognizing that it represents Hardin's perspective on his own life, written at a time when he was seeking to shape public perception and possibly hoping for clemency or early release. The number of violent encounters in which Hardin was involved represents another area where legend and reality diverge significantly. At various times, Hardin claimed to have been involved in confrontations with more than 40 individuals, a number that became widely repeated and that contributed to his reputation as one of the deadliest figures of the Old West. However, careful research by historians examining court records, contemporary newspaper accounts, and other documentary evidence suggests that the actual number of documented incidents is considerably lower, perhaps in the range of 15 to 20 cases where evidence supports his involvement in serious violence. This discrepancy between claimed incidents and documented cases illustrates a broader problem in Old West history. Many of the most famous figures of the era, including gunfighters, lawmen, and outlaws, have had their exploits inflated through repetition and embellishment. In some cases, individuals themselves contributed to these exaggerations, recognizing that a fearsome reputation could serve as a form of protection or could bring a certain kind of fame. In other cases, writers and storytellers added to the legends, creating narratives that were more dramatic and satisfying than the often mundane reality. Another famous story associated with Hardin involves his alleged encounters with Wild Bill Hickok in Abilene. According to some versions of this tale, the two men had a tense confrontation, with each recognizing the other as a dangerous opponent and carefully avoiding escalation. Other versions suggest they developed a kind of mutual respect or even friendship. Hardin's own account describes meeting Hickok and having various interactions with him, but the details are vague and sometimes contradictory. Contemporary records from Abilene confirm that both men were present in the town during overlapping periods, but documentation of any specific dramatic encounter between them is limited. The appeal of such stories is understandable. The idea of two legendary gunfighters meeting and sizing each other up creates a compelling narrative that speaks to our fascination with the Old West as a place of dramatic confrontations and larger-than-life personalities. However, the historical reality was likely more prosaic. Abilene was a busy cattle town during the trail drive season, with hundreds of people coming and going. The presence of two individuals who would later become famous does not necessarily mean they had any particularly memorable interaction. Sometimes the absence of documentation simply reflects the absence of anything particularly noteworthy occurring. The process by which Hardin's story was transformed into legend accelerated after his death in 1895. In the decades that followed, the Old West itself was being transformed from a recent memory into a mythologized past. As the frontier closed and the United States became increasingly urbanized and industrialized, there developed a nostalgic fascination with the frontier era, seen as a time of freedom, adventure, and individual agency. Figures like Hardin became characters in this larger mythological landscape, symbols of a vanished world, rather than fully realized historical individuals. The publication of Hardin's autobiography in 1896, shortly after his death, provided a primary source that would influence virtually all subsequent accounts of his life. However, the document itself is problematic as a historical source. Written while Hardin was attempting to rehabilitate his reputation and possibly secure early release from prison, it presents a selective and self-serving account of his experiences. He consistently portrays himself as acting in self-defense or in response to provocation, rarely acknowledging agency in initiating conflicts. Modern historians must approach this document as one piece of evidence among many, useful for understanding how Hardin wished to be perceived, but not necessarily reliable, as an objective account of events. Popular culture has played a significant role in perpetuating and expanding the Hardin legend. Books, films, television shows, and other media have featured versions of his story, often taking significant liberties with historical facts in the service of dramatic narrative. The snoring incident, in particular, has appeared in numerous fictional treatments, usually presented as fact, and often embellished with additional details not found in any historical source. Each retelling of the story tends to make it more dramatic and more definitive, further obscuring whatever historical reality may underlie it. It is worth considering why the snoring story, specifically, has proven so enduring and popular. On one level, it presents Hardin as extraordinarily dangerous and unpredictable, willing to resort to extreme action over a minor annoyance. This fits a certain archetype of the frontier gunfighter, as someone who lives outside normal social constraints and responds to situations with violence that seems shocking to modern sensibilities. On another level, there is something almost darkly humorous about the story, a quality that makes it memorable and repeatable. The juxtaposition of the mundane annoyance of snoring with the extreme response creates a narrative tension that makes the story stick in the mind. However, we must also consider what this story obscures or oversimplifies about the historical Hardin and about frontier violence more generally. By reducing a complex individual to a single dramatic anecdote, we lose sight of the broader context in which he operated. The violence of the frontier era was not primarily the result of individual temperament or casual cruelty, but emerged from complex social, economic, and political conditions. The breakdown of traditional authority during Reconstruction, the competition for resources, the tensions between different groups with conflicting interests, all of these factors contributed to an environment where violence was unfortunately common. Hardin's own background as the son of a Methodist preacher, his education, his attempts to maintain family connections, even while living as a fugitive, all suggest a more complex individual than the one-dimensional figure of legend. He was capable of writing articulate letters. He had friends and family who remained loyal to him despite his troubles, and he apparently believed that his actions were justified by circumstances. None of this excuses the violence in which he participated, but it does suggest that understanding him requires looking beyond the dramatic stories to the fuller picture of his life and times. The challenge for historians studying figures like Hardin is to navigate between uncritical acceptance of legend and overly skeptical dismissal of all dramatic accounts. Some events that seem improbable or exaggerated may actually have occurred, while other widely accepted stories may have little basis in fact. The methodology requires careful examination of multiple sources, attention to contemporary documentation rather than later recollections, and awareness of the biases and limitations of available evidence. In Hardin's case, this means treating his autobiography as one important source, while also consulting court records, newspaper accounts, and other documentation from the period. One aspect of the Hardin story that has received less attention than the dramatic incidents is his time in prison, which began in 1878 and continued until his release in 1894. During these 16 years, Hardin was removed from the frontier environment that had shaped his earlier life and placed in a confined institutional setting. His behavior during this period provides interesting insights into his character. He studied law, apparently with considerable success, and was known as a relatively well-behaved prisoner for much of his sentence. This suggests capabilities and interests that the focus on his violent past can obscure. The transformation of Hardin from active participant in frontier violence to prisoner studying law books represents a dramatic shift that the popular legends rarely capture. It is easier and more dramatic to focus on the gunfights and narrow escapes than on the long years of imprisonment and the apparent attempt to prepare for a different kind of life after release. Yet this period is crucial for understanding the full arc of his story and the person he was beyond the legend. When examining the various stories associated with Hardin, including the snoring incident, we must also consider the broader phenomenon of how the Old West has been remembered and portrayed. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the development of what we might call the mythology of the West, a set of narratives and character types that reflected not so much historical reality as cultural desires and anxieties. The gunfighter became a central figure in this mythology, representing both the freedom and the danger of frontier life, both the romance of individual agency and the threat of lawlessness. Hardin fit into this mythological framework in complex ways. He could be portrayed as a villain, a dangerous criminal whose violence threatened civilized society. He could also be portrayed as a tragic figure, a man of capability, and even honor who was pushed into violence by circumstances beyond his control. Different accounts emphasized different aspects of his story, depending on the perspective and purposes of the teller. This flexibility is part of what has made his story continue to fascinate people more than a century after his death. The snoring incident, whether it happened as commonly told or not, has become an integral part of the Hardin legend because it serves particular narrative purposes. It provides a memorable and dramatic illustration of his reputation for violence. It suggests a certain dark charisma, a willingness to act decisively, even if inappropriately. It fits into broader patterns of Old West storytelling where casual violence becomes a marker of frontier authenticity. Understanding why such stories persist and what functions they serve helps us understand not just Hardin, but how we collectively remember and interpret the frontier past. As we separate myth from reality in Hardin's story, we are left with a figure who remains significant, but who is also revealed as more human and more understandable than the legend suggests. He was a product of his time and place, shaped by the specific conditions of Reconstruction Texas, by family background, by personal choices, and by the opportunities and constraints he encountered. His story illuminates broader patterns of frontier violence, the limitations of law enforcement during the period, and the complex social dynamics of a society in transition. By examining the legends critically while remaining open to the historical realities they may contain, we can develop a more nuanced and accurate understanding of both the man and his era. The story of John Wesley Hardin's final years begins not with violence but with transformation, or at least the attempt at transformation. When he entered the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville in 1878 to begin serving his 25-year sentence for the killing of Charles Webb, Hardin was 25 years old, a man whose entire adult life had been defined by conflict and flight. The prison years would change him in ways that were both genuine and superficial, preparing him for a return to society that would ultimately prove tragically brief. The Texas State Penitentiary during the late 19th century was a harsh environment designed more for punishment than rehabilitation. Prisoners faced strict discipline, hard labor, and limited contact with the outside world. For someone like Hardin, accustomed to freedom of movement and constant action, the adjustment to confinement must have been profound. However, historical records suggest that after an initial difficult period, he adapted to prison life with surprising success. He became known as a relatively compliant prisoner who avoided the worst disciplinary problems that plagued many inmates. One of the most significant developments during Hardin's incarceration was his decision to study law. The Texas prison system at that time allowed prisoners access to books and educational materials, and Hardin took advantage of this opportunity. He devoted considerable time to reading law books, studying legal procedures, and preparing for the possibility of practicing law after his release. This intellectual engagement represented a dramatic departure from his previous life and suggested a genuine desire to establish a legitimate professional identity. His study of law was not superficial. Records indicate he developed substantial knowledge of legal principles and procedures. The question of how sincere Hardin's transformation was during his prison years has been debated by historians. Some view his study of law and good behavior as cynical efforts to secure early release, while others see evidence of genuine change in a man who had been given time to reflect on his past and consider his future. The truth likely contains elements of both perspectives. Hardin was clearly intelligent enough to recognize that demonstrating reform would improve his chances of early release, but the dedication he showed to his studies and the letters he wrote during this period also suggest real intellectual engagement and perhaps some genuine self-examination. During his imprisonment, Hardin maintained correspondence with family members and with Jane, his wife, though their relationship was strained by the long separation. Jane and their children faced considerable hardship during his incarceration, struggling financially and dealing with the social stigma attached to being associated with a convicted criminal. The letters between Hardin and his family reveal a man concerned about their welfare and frustrated by his inability to provide for them. These documents offer a glimpse of the personal cost of his earlier choices, not just for himself, but for those connected to him. The political climate in Texas was changing during Hardin's years in prison. The Reconstruction era had ended in the late 1870s, and former Confederates had regained control of state government. This shift in political power meant that someone like Hardin, whose troubles had begun during the conflicts of the Reconstruction period, was now viewed somewhat differently by those in authority. Some who had once seen him as a dangerous criminal now viewed him with more sympathy, seeing his past actions through the lens of resistance to what they considered an oppressive government. This change in political atmosphere would eventually play a role in his release. In 1894, after serving 16 years of his 25-year sentence, John Wesley Hardin was granted a pardon by Governor James Hogg. The decision to pardon him was controversial and reflected the complex politics of the time. Supporters of the pardon argued that Hardin had been a model prisoner, had demonstrated genuine reformation through his study of law, and had suffered enough for his crimes. Critics argued that he was a dangerous man whose release endangered public safety. The debate over his pardon reflected broader questions about justice, redemption, and the purpose of imprisonment that remain relevant today. Upon his release in 1894, Hardin was 41 years old, emerging into a Texas that had changed considerably during his 16 years of confinement. The frontier era was definitively over. Railroads connected once remote areas. Towns had grown into cities, and the kind of environment in which he had operated in the 1870s no longer existed. The challenge facing him was whether he could adapt to this changed world and establish the legitimate life he had apparently prepared for during his time in prison. Hardin initially settled in Gonzales, Texas, and attempted to establish himself as an attorney. He passed the bar examination, a genuine achievement that demonstrated his intellectual capabilities and the seriousness of his legal studies. He opened a law office and began accepting clients, attempting to build a practice and a respectable life. For a time, it appeared that his reinvention might succeed. He represented clients in various matters, conducted himself professionally, and seemed to be making the transition from notorious criminal to legitimate professional. However, the past proved difficult to escape entirely. Hardin's reputation followed him, and while some people were willing to give him a chance at redemption, others remained deeply suspicious of his transformation. His history made him a subject of continuing interest and scrutiny. Newspapers reported on his activities, sometimes sensationalizing his past and questioning his reformation. The weight of his legend, the very stories that had made him famous, now complicated his efforts to establish a normal life. He was not simply John Hardin, attorney at law, but John Wesley Hardin, the notorious gunfighter trying to reform. During this period, Hardin also worked on his autobiography, the document that would become the primary source for many later accounts of his life. His motivations for writing this memoir were complex. On one level, it represented an attempt to tell his own story, to present his version of events, and to justify his past actions. On another level, it may have been an effort to profit from his notoriety, recognizing that there was public interest in his life story. The autobiography presents Hardin as he wished to be seen, a man forced into violence by circumstances rather than someone who chose a violent path. Personal troubles continued to complicate Hardin's post-prison life. His wife Jane had died while he was still in prison, a loss that affected him deeply despite their long separation. He eventually remarried, but this second marriage was brief and troubled, ending in separation. He developed drinking problems and was involved in several public disputes that, while not resulting in violence, suggested that his temper and his difficulty managing conflict remained concerns. The disciplined prisoner who had studied law books was struggling with the challenges of freedom and the complications of rebuilding a life. In early 1895, Hardin made a decision that would prove fateful. He moved to El Paso, a rough border town in far west Texas that still retained some of the frontier character that had largely disappeared from other parts of the state. El Paso in the 1890s was known for its saloons, gambling establishments, and general atmosphere of disorder. It was perhaps not the ideal environment for someone attempting to maintain a reformed life, but it may have appealed to Hardin precisely because it was more tolerant of rough behavior and less judgmental about past reputations than more settled communities. In El Paso, Hardin became involved in various legal matters, some legitimate and some questionable. He represented clients in criminal cases and became entangled in the complex and sometimes corrupt world of border politics and law enforcement. He also spent considerable time in saloons and gambling halls, drinking heavily and engaging in the kind of behavior that was far removed from the reformed professional he had attempted to become in Gonzales. The trajectory of his post-prison life was clearly moving in a troubling direction, away from rehabilitation and back toward the patterns that had defined his earlier years. During his time in El Paso, Hardin became involved with a woman named Beulah Morose, also known as Mrs. Morose, whose husband Martin Morose was in jail. The exact nature of Hardin's relationship with Beulah and his involvement in the Morose situation has been the subject of much speculation and conflicting accounts. What is documented is that he was handling some legal matters related to Martin Morose, and that this connection would ultimately lead to his death. The details remain murky, but it appears that Hardin's involvement in this situation created enemies and put him in a dangerous position. On August 19, 1895, John Wesley Hardin was in the Acme Saloon in El Paso, standing at the bar and drinking. John Selman, a local constable with a questionable reputation himself, entered the saloon and approached Hardin from behind. Without warning or confrontation, Selman drew his weapon and shot Hardin in the head, killing him instantly. The shooting occurred around 7 p.m., and Hardin died without ever seeing his assailant. He was 42 years old, less than a year and a half after his release from prison. The circumstances surrounding Hardin's death have been analyzed and debated extensively. The killing was clearly not a fair fight or a typical gunfighter confrontation of the type celebrated in Western mythology. It was an execution-style shooting from behind, giving Hardin no opportunity to defend himself. The motivations for the killing remain somewhat unclear, though they appear to be connected to the Morose situation, and possibly to conflicts between different factions in El Paso's corrupt law enforcement and political circles. Selman claimed he acted in the line of duty, but many observers then and since have questioned this explanation. John Selman himself would not survive long after killing Hardin. Less than a year later, in April 1896, Selman was killed by George Scarborough, a U.S. Marshal, in circumstances that were also controversial. The rapid series of violent deaths involving Hardin, Selman, and others connected to El Paso's underworld illustrated that even in the 1890s, in a supposedly civilized era, the patterns of frontier violence could persist in certain environments. El Paso in this period was something of an anachronism, a place where the rough justice and personal conflicts of an earlier era continued to play out. The news of Hardin's death was widely reported in newspapers across Texas and beyond. Reactions were mixed. Some expressed satisfaction that a dangerous criminal had finally met his end. Others saw tragedy in the death of a man who had attempted, however imperfectly, to reform and build a legitimate life. Still others focused on the manner of his death, noting the irony that a man famous for his skill with firearms had been shot from behind without warning. The various responses to his death reflected the different ways people had interpreted his life and his significance. Hardin was buried in the Concordia Cemetery in El Paso, in a grave that has become a site of interest for those fascinated by Old West history. His funeral was attended by a number of people, suggesting that despite his troubled reputation, he had maintained some personal connections in El Paso. The grave marker and the cemetery have since become minor tourist attractions, one of many places where the history and mythology of the Old West are commemorated and consumed by later generations seeking connection to that past. The publication of Hardin's autobiography in 1896, the year after his death, ensured that his own version of his life story would continue to influence how he was remembered and understood. The book went through multiple editions and became a primary source for countless later accounts of his life. Modern historians must approach it critically, but it remains an invaluable document for understanding how Hardin wished to be perceived and how he understood his own experiences. The autobiography contributed significantly to the legend that grew around his name in the decades after his death. In the years and decades following his death, John Wesley Hardin became one of the most written-about figures of the Old West. Books, articles, and eventually films and television programs featured versions of his story. He became a character in the larger mythology of the frontier, representing various aspects of that era, depending on the perspective of the writer or filmmaker. Some portrayals emphasized his violence and criminality, presenting him as an example of frontier lawlessness. Others took a more sympathetic view, portraying him as a tragic figure or even as a misunderstood hero. The question of how to evaluate Hardin's place in history is complex and depends partly on what aspects of his story we emphasize. If we focus primarily on his criminal record and the violence associated with his name, he appears as a destructive figure whose actions caused considerable harm. If we emphasize his intelligence, his family connections, and his attempts at reformation, a more sympathetic portrait emerges. Most likely, the truth encompasses elements of both perspectives. He was a complex individual whose life was shaped by particular historical circumstances, and whose choices had consequences both for himself and for others. Understanding Hardin's significance requires placing him in the broader context of his times. The Texas of his youth and early adulthood was a place recovering from civil war, experiencing political upheaval, and undergoing rapid social change. The breakdown of traditional authority structures, the conflicts between different groups with competing interests, and the gradual extension of more formal systems of law and order, all created an environment where someone like Hardin could emerge. He was both a product of these circumstances and an actor who shaped events through his choices. The transformation of the American West from frontier to settled region was occurring during Hardin's lifetime, and his story reflects different stages of this transformation. His early years coincided with the height of frontier disorder, when large areas were only loosely controlled by formal authorities, and when personal violence was a common means of resolving disputes. His imprisonment in the late 1870s and 1880s coincided with the period when state authority was becoming more firmly established and when the frontier era was definitively ending. His release in the 1890s occurred in a Texas that had largely been pacified, though pockets like El Paso retained some frontier characteristics. The appeal of Hardin's story to later generations speaks to enduring fascinations with the Old West as a cultural symbol. The frontier represents an American mythology, a place of freedom, adventure, and individual agency, but also of danger, violence, and moral ambiguity. Figures like Hardin embody these contradictions, serving as symbols of both the romance and the tragedy of the frontier experience. The continuing interest in his life reflects not just historical curiosity, but also the ways that Americans have used the frontier past to explore questions about violence, justice, authority, and individual responsibility. In evaluating Hardin's legacy, we must also consider the human costs of the violence with which he was associated. Each incident involved real people, families affected by loss, and communities disrupted by conflict. The legends that grew around Hardin and others like him often romanticize or trivialize this violence, focusing on dramatic confrontations while ignoring the suffering caused. A complete historical understanding requires acknowledging these costs and recognizing that whatever else Hardin may have been, his actions contributed to real harm. The story of John Wesley Hardin's attempt at reformation and his ultimate failure to escape his past raises questions about redemption and the possibility of change. He clearly made efforts to transform himself during his prison years and after his release. He studied law seriously, passed the bar examination, and attempted to establish a legitimate professional practice. Yet he also struggled with personal demons, with the weight of his reputation, and with patterns of behavior that proved difficult to change. His story suggests both the possibility of change and the powerful pull of the past. The manner of Hardin's death, shot from behind without warning, stands in stark contrast to the dramatic confrontations of Western mythology. There was nothing heroic or romantic about his end, just a middle-aged man drinking in a saloon, killed by someone approaching from behind. This unglamorous reality serves as a corrective to some of the mythology surrounding frontier violence. The reality was often sordid, brutal, and meaningless rather than dramatic and significant. More than a century after his death, John Wesley Hardin remains a figure of fascination and debate. Historians continue to research his life, trying to separate fact from legend and to understand him in the context of his times. Writers and filmmakers continue to find his story compelling, though their portrayals vary widely in accuracy and interpretation. The public continues to be interested in his life, as evidenced by the steady stream of books, articles, and documentaries that feature his story. What lessons can we draw from the life of John Wesley Hardin? His story illustrates the ways that historical circumstances shape individual lives, how violence can become a pattern that is difficult to break, and how legends can obscure as much as they reveal about the past. It shows us the human capacity for both violence and intellectual achievement, for both destruction and attempted reform. It reminds us that historical figures were complex individuals rather than simple heroes or villains, and that understanding them requires looking beyond dramatic anecdotes to the fuller context of their lives. The Old West that produced John Wesley Hardin was a real place inhabited by real people facing genuine challenges and making consequential choices. It was not the mythological landscape of cowboy films or dime novels, but a complex society in transition, experiencing rapid change and grappling with questions about law, order, justice, and community. Figures like Hardin can serve as windows into understanding this world, provided we approach them with appropriate critical perspective and awareness of how legends develop and persist. As we conclude our examination of John Wesley Hardin's life, from his birth in 1853 to his death in 1895, we see a trajectory that encompasses much of the frontier experience. His early years reflected the disorder of post-Civil War Texas. His active years coincided with the height of frontier violence. His imprisonment paralleled the gradual establishment of more effective law enforcement and state authority, and his final years occurred in a West that was rapidly losing its frontier character. Through his story, we can trace broader historical patterns and understand something of what life was like during a transformative period in American history. The question of how to remember John Wesley Hardin and others like him remains open. Should we emphasize their violence and the harm they caused, or their complexity as human beings shaped by difficult circumstances? Should we celebrate them as colorful historical figures, or should we view them more critically as symbols of a violent and often unjust era? Perhaps the answer is that we should strive for understanding rather than simple judgment, recognizing both the fascination these figures generate and the serious questions their lives raise about violence, justice, and social order. In doing so, we honor the complexity of the past and resist the temptation to reduce history to simple morality tales or entertaining legends.